Hey, welcome everyone to the Everyday Investor podcast. And I think this one is coming out pretty close to Christmas. So happy birthday, baby Jesus. Merry Christmas, everyone. I'd love to say something inspiring, but, in the interest of being evergreen, let's get down to business. I'd like to start by asking you to consider which industry, organization, or commodity has the most to lose should widespread adoption of Bitcoin occur. Which industry, organization, or commodity, increasingly perceived as inefficient or untrustworthy, faces the highest risk of disruption due to technological advancements? And simultaneously, which of these has the resources, market position, or innovation culture to most effectively defend itself against such disruptions? Sorry for all the words. I can't I can't compress that any more than I already have. But who am I talking about? Am I talking about big pharma, the military industrial complex, OPEC? Keep guessing. Consider some of the hallmark footprints or fingerprints, if you like. Lawyers, task forces, exemptions, collusion, with immense capacity to resist or create obfuscation. Of course, I won't tell you who I'm talking about here or what I'm talking about, but you have a few guesses in the next hour-ish. Always for sale is the right to influence the masses. As it relates to Bitcoin, once you realize what is disrupting, you can understand why all of the negative reporting over the past, 10 years at least. Bitcoin's bad for the environment. It's used by criminals. It's a Ponzi scheme. It has no value. The unholy trinity of fear, uncertainty, and doubt strikes again. It's the hallmark of an organized campaign to misinform the masses around the usefulness of Bitcoin. My guest today is Daniel Batten, and if you've been learning about Bitcoin for even just a short period of time, and you're a fan of the environment, you would have heard of this guy. He's speaking to me from where he lives now in Costa Rica with his family, but originally Daniel is a Kiwi. Now, we're touching a little bit on the false environmental narratives in the area of Bitcoin mining, and then I'm picking his brain on something a little bit closer to home on a daily basis these days for me, how to talk to other people about Bitcoin when they're not quite sure. So I hope you enjoy this. And as a reminder, there are a couple of free online courses that I built over the past few years that are there ready for you. Links are in the show notes. But in particular, I want to draw your attention to Crypto 101, Crypto with Confidence. 5 easy to follow video lessons from 5 different presenters guiding you through the most essential steps of setting up your own digital wallet and getting started with crypto. Again, link is in the show notes. So I hope you enjoy this discussion with Daniel Batten. If you do, and if you're listening in on YouTube or somewhere where you can leave a comment, I'd love to know what some of your thoughts are around the fear and uncertainty and the doubt aspects of Bitcoin at the moment. Do you think that there really are things to worry about, like quantum computing, for example? Or do you think really we got nothing to worry about whatsoever? All part of due diligence. So let's get started on the show. Hope you enjoy it. You are listening in to the Everyday Investor Podcast, and I'm Darcy Ungaro. Business, shares, crypto, property, precious metals, and managed funds. It's not about the tools, though. It's about the dream and how much risk you're willing to take along the way. I'm aiming for a healthy margin above an average result for myself, my family, and the people I work with. If you're an everyday person, then please join me. The Everyday Investor Podcast thanks past, present, and future partners of the show. Special mention to Ungaro & Co. for financial advice, Gorilla Technologies for strategic IT solutions, and Icehouse Ventures for investment into Kiwi tech startups. Check out the show notes, subscribe to the fortnightly newsletter, say hello on the socials, and leave a 5-star review. But most importantly, remember, this isn't advice. If you need that, reach out to me or contact your current financial advisor for input. Thanks for joining me on this one. Let's make a start. Awesome. Hey, welcome everybody to the Everyday Investor. Today I'm catching up with Daniel Batten. Daniel, how are you? And thank you for joining me today.
It's great to be here, and thanks for the invitation.
So tell us a little bit about your background. People will recognize very quickly you're from another place. You're from New Zealand. So tell us a little bit about how you ended up where you're at right now, both physically and vocationally.
I was running a climate tech fund and second fund, and we were starting to ask questions about how much impact we were having. And the answer was some, but pretty minimal compared to what we could. And we realized that we wanted to be investing in technologies that could mitigate methane emissions because the UN tells us that that's actually our single biggest lever to reduce climate change now. So we pivoted the fund focus, and long story short, we found that Bitcoin was going to be a great way to do it, Bitcoin mining. And a lot of the projects we wanted to do were on landfills, and a lot of the ones that were in our sweet spot were in Latin America. And so that eventually, long story short, led us to Costa Rica. And so I pivoted from climate tech into discovering that Bitcoin is probably the best ESG asset I've seen out of the last 200 that I've seen. And that's pivoted our entire fund focus and also where we live.
So the first sort of awareness that I had of you was probably maybe a couple of years ago when I was trying to go online and research a response, a well-considered and thoughtful response to a question that or a resistance that kept on coming up from people that I was talking about with Bitcoin around how it is quote unquote bad for the environment. So can you break down just what that narrative is, maybe even where it came from? Like, why is
Mhm.
Bitcoin bad for the environment? Would be my first question.
Yeah, well, that was my first impression. I remember still to this day in 2017 seeing an article in Wired magazine, which was quoting a study which had recently been done at that time about Bitcoin's energy consumption. And they were projecting it forward and saying it could use serious amounts of energy and that could hamper our efforts to transition to renewable energy sources. So, as a climate tech investor, I was originally very skeptical about Bitcoin
Mhm.
and saw it as a negative and part of the climate problem, not as a climate solution. And when someone presented it to me as something that could be a form of climate technology, you can imagine my first reaction. But as investors, we have a need to be evaluating all technologies neutrally and putting aside prejudice. Because if we allow our own prejudices to get in the way, we could miss out on a good investment opportunity, but also something that could be part of fulfilling our mandate. So I had to put aside those prejudices and start researching it. And I found that there was a lot of claims that were made within the Bitcoin mining industry about how Bitcoin mining could be used kind of like a shock absorber for the grid, where you put more renewable energy on the grid. But because it's intermittent, the sun could go behind a cloud, the wind could stop blowing at any time. You need to have a shock absorber that can very quickly ramp up and ramp down energy. And Bitcoin provided that. And I could see conceptually through my limited knowledge of grids how that could work. The other argument that was put forward was that often, because wind does get curtailed and solar does get curtailed because it's produced at the wrong part of the country and it cannot be transported effectively, or it's produced at the wrong time of day when other people don't need it, that often that gets sent into the ground. And in Australia, around 30% of all renewable energy is already curtailed. That's scheduled to go up more. There's been a report in the UK that says that £1 billion worth of energy is simply wasted from renewable sources every single year. So the argument was, well, you could use that energy for Bitcoin mining because it's location agnostic and it's a flexible user of energy and it can quickly ramp up and ramp down. So that could be a customer, and then those renewable operators could do what any prudent business operator does, which is they reinvest those profits into expanding their solar farm or expanding their wind farm. So it sounded great in theory, but I couldn't see any strong evidence for it. So I was not completely convinced, and there hadn't been anything quantified. And I started to dig a little bit deeper, and then I found that another property of Bitcoin was it could be used to monetize stranded methane, which could come from a landfill, could come from a farm, could come from an oil and gas field, because when people strike oil, they also strike gas. And if you haven't got a gas pipeline, often that gas is simply flared. You burn it, but it burns it impartially, and methane still escapes into the air. And that's 84 times more warming to the atmosphere than carbon dioxide is. And sometimes it doesn't even get flared, it just gets freely vented, even though you're not technically supposed to do that, which is even worse again. And landfills is one of our top three emitters. And the problem is that landfills are always in the wrong place. So unless you can convert that methane using a generator into power and sell that power into the grid, which happens in New Zealand quite a lot because we're a long, skinny country and you're often near the grid and there's a good grid interconnection. But for most of the world, that's not true. Most of the world, the landfill is miles from the grid. They've got no option to sell it to the grid. So what do? You've got purely stranded power. And the argument was, well, that could be used for Bitcoin mining. Now, what I found was that when I did some more research, there were a number of Bitcoin mining companies that were already doing this. Bitcoin mining companies that were already on landfills, that were already in oil fields, that were already using stranded solar and stranded renewable energy. But the story hadn't been told. And so I had to go looking for that data because certainly the press wasn't telling me that. And the more I discovered it, the more I thought, hey, this isn't just conjecture. This isn't just greenwash from the Bitcoin mining industry trying to justify its incredible energy payload so that number can go up. This actually has some real basis to it. This is exciting. And that started to pivot my awareness to go, hey, we could actually utilize Bitcoin mining because it's an existing technology, not like the technologies that we had been investing in, which were future technologies, which may or may not be successful. And even if they were, would probably only have an impact on the climate after 2035. We could actually do something at scale using existing technology right now. So that got me excited. Now, to your question about where does the information about Bitcoin is bad for the environment come from, there's a couple of places. The first is that there's some things in life that are just really counterintuitive. And for example, back in the day, before the Copernican revolution, it was counterintuitive, the idea that the Earth revolved around the sun, because our senses tell us, well, that's not true. I can see with my own senses that the sun rises in the east and it does a trajectory, a hemisphere, and then it sets in the west every day. So clearly the sun is revolving around the Earth. But in fact, there were two counterintuitive truths coming into confluence, which is that the Earth's rotating on its axis as it rotates around the sun that creates this illusion. And so it's very similar with Bitcoin mining in that absolutely it uses a huge amount of energy. And usually that's not a good thing because with a traditional data center, if it uses a lot of energy, then that means the grid operator has to put more fossil fuel onto the grid because fossil fuel is generally the most reliable source of energy. It's not going to go behind a cloud, which is no good if you're an Amazon data center and you need that 24/7 reliability, or else you suddenly don't have customers anymore. You have customers screaming at you. But Bitcoin mining data centers, they don't have that same need for that 24/7 uptime, so they can be flexible. All they lose is that little bit of Bitcoin that they don't mine in that time that the sun goes behind a cloud. So that allows the grid operator to build out the grid in a much more renewable-based way. So part of the misinformation is just that it's counterintuitive, that using more energy could actually be good for the environment. And then I started to dig a little bit more, and I realized that this is well known within the environmental movement. That contrary to what we might think, which is that all environmentalists think we should use less energy, actually there's only about a quarter of environmentalists who think that. The other 3/4 are pragmatists, and they understand very deeply that in order to have a green transition, well, you can't have more power generation if you have not more power demand. I mean, who's going to open a bakery in a street where people are eating less bread, right? It's not going to happen. So similarly, if people are using less energy, how are we possibly going to get more power generation onto the grid? So you have to have more energy demand to create that more energy supply and more renewable energy supply. So most environmentalists understand this. We have to use more energy, but it's more of the right type of energy, more energy that can be running off renewable power sources. And it just so happens that Bitcoin mining provides that incredibly flexible user of energy that can incentivize the acceleration of renewable energy onto the grid.
Fantastic. So you can turn it on and off, and that's what you're referring to, right? It's the right type of energy demand to fit well with sometimes the peaks and troughs and the patterns that renewables present in terms of its energy profile, right?
We've actually never had an energy consumer that's been as flexible. The closest we've ever had is a steel plant or an aluminium plant that can shut off if you give it some time and some warning, but it can't shut off in seconds. Bitcoin mining can shut off within 1.3 seconds, and it can shut off to exactly the right amount that the grid operator needs. Whereas an aluminium smelter, it's either on or it's off, and you can turn it off. It takes about half an hour to go through all the industrial processes. And then you turn it off, and then you have the opposite problem, because then you've got not enough demand. So then the grid operator's got to counterbalance in the reverse direction. And then the third problem is, well, after a while, steel starts to harden and aluminium starts to harden. So it only gives you a 4 hour window. Whereas, what use is that if you have a heat wave that's lasting for 72 hours?
Hmm.
It's not good enough. So with a Bitcoin mining operation, then you can keep the power off the grid for as long as the grid operator needs it. So it's more flexible, it's more
Yeah.
instantaneous, and it has greater longevity as well. And it's
Okay.
more precisely able to be calibrated to exactly the levels that the grid operator needs. So it's an absolute panacea for a grid operator who is wanting to put more renewables on the grid and do the right thing, but they really don't want to because they know that it makes their job of stabilizing the grid much harder when your power sources are intermittent. And
Yeah.
so you have to, the only way you can do it, there's two ways: batteries and flexible energy users. And it's not an either or, we actually need both. And the International Energy Association has said that to meet our net zero emission targets, we need to 10x our number of batteries on the grid, and we need to 10x our numbers of flexible users of energy. And that's the category that Bitcoin mining enters into.
And so when it comes to these narratives that appear where Bitcoin is bad for the environment because it's just sucking all the power and that's just, it's bad, right? Like it's a very surface level argument. And then when you look into the data, it is actually easily debunked. But unfortunately, bad news travels faster than good news often. And it's
Correct. And
more,
it's one of those sound bites that, because we don't have a generally energy literate population, most people don't understand how grids work or what electricity actually is beyond something that you turn on a light switch and it comes on. But what happens behind the scenes is just this complete mystery. So people don't understand that electricity has to be constantly matched in supply and demand, or you get blackouts or brownouts. And so the grid operator needs these shock absorbers to be able to keep the lights on.
hmm,
So one source of this misinformation has been genuine misconceptions. But like a lot of things, not all of it has been genuine. And we've seen this throughout the passage of time. Whenever you have a disruptive technology, the disruptor doesn't just stand back and say, well, clearly, the horse and buggy industry didn't say, oh, the automobile's clearly superior, so let's just hang up our boots and either go into the automobile industry or let's retire. No, they fought them. When the radio came in and live entertainment was threatened and the telegraph was threatened, again, these industries fought them. When the internet came in, the print media fought. When the bicycle came in, again, riding apparel, public transport, all the existing technologies that were threatened with disintermediation fought and fought vehemently to keep their established position. And so we're seeing the same pattern play out again. Now, who does Bitcoin disintermediate?
good
Central
question.
banks, financial advisors in some cases, people responsible for administering remittance payments around the world, and to some extent, the banking system. And so those are some pretty powerful institutions there. And so it's no surprise that when you look at the sources of most of the information on Bitcoin in the early days, where did it come from? Bank of International Settlements, Central Bank of the Netherlands, the European Central Bank. So three central banks. Now, that might just be a complete coincidence, but if we look at the track record of history and how disrupted industries behave, that would suggest that this is a disrupted industry doing what a disruptive industry always does, which is to promote fear, uncertainty, and doubt about the disruptive technology. And so we're seeing this play out again, and we should be unsurprised by this.
So what you're, and just I guess, not to kind of drill down and make too much of a big deal of it, but what you're effectively saying is that it is almost like a PR campaign, which is launched, and it's not unusual. This happens. Like I think most of what we read in mainstream media has probably been paid to be put there. So this shouldn't be surprising to people. But I think over time, when there's a new technology that comes in, there are certain cohorts of people that get it before others, right? And so where we're at right now in terms of the adoption cycle, where are we? And what does the media FUD, or the narrative around Bitcoin bad being, bad for the environment thing, where does that sit in the spectrum? Like, is that kind of one of the key hurdles needed to overcome to get the next cohort of people to adopt this?
People have different opinions on this. Some people say it's irrelevant. People don't trust the media as much as they used to. My opinion is a little different. I think it is really important because whilst it's true that mainstream media doesn't have as much influence, it's not as highly regarded as it used to be in the 1970s. It doesn't have no influence, it still has some influence. And I liken it to what's happened to antibiotics over time. Antibiotics have also become less effective at fighting bacteria. So, what does a medic do? Well, they just up the supply of antibiotics until they kill what they want to kill anyway. So it's the same strategy. Yes, the media is probably less trusted than it was a couple of generations ago, but there's been so much information put out there about Bitcoin, which has been negative over such a pronounced period of time that the dosage has been such that a lot of it has sunk into the popular consciousness anyway. So it is important that we go through the process of correcting those narratives, of correcting those myths and supplying the facts to augment those myths or to replace those myths so that people don't have those obstacles. Because the reality is that we're early, only 4.7% of the world has adopted Bitcoin. That's the upper bound estimate.
Yeah.
So that means there's more than 95% who haven't. And a lot of them have gained the belief that, well, I don't want to be in Bitcoin because I don't think it's anything other than a speculative asset. I don't think it does anything good for humanity. And it seems like it's not that good for the environment. And if you have that belief set, then that's going to keep you out of investing in the best performing asset of the last 10 years and probably the best performing asset of the next 10 years as well. So it's important that we correct those narratives to continue mainstream adoption, but also so that regular people have a chance to realize that this asset is probably much more value aligned than they could possibly imagine.
Yeah. Hey everyone, just a real quick announcement here. Please pardon the intrusion. I just wanted to make a special announcement. Icehouse Ventures, a Kiwi venture capital firm that's been investing in Kiwi startups since 2001, is going to partner with the Everyday Investor podcast for 6 months. Really appreciate that. And by the way, thank you very much to all past partners and sponsors of this podcast: Hatch, Quora Wealth, Easy Crypto, and others. Now, Icehouse, though, they were early supporters of companies that you may know. Companies like Henry, with no E, Henry, Sharesies, Crimson Education, and Tradeify. Investing in startups, though, right? Growing entrepreneurs and investing in innovation here in New Zealand can help all of us become more wealthy. There's just such a massive spillover effect for all of New Zealand, I think. So for me, it's just a complete natural fit to have them on board. Now, on this, because of regulation in New Zealand and minimum investment sizes, you need to be what's called a wholesale investor to invest in most venture capital funds. But right now, Icehouse Ventures are working on opening up venture investing to more everyday retail investors. Visit icehouseventures.co.nz/startup investing to register your interest. No money is currently being sought, and when a retail fund is available, any offer will be made in accordance with the Financial Markets Conduct Act 2013. But thank you again, Icehouse Ventures, for supporting the Everyday Investor podcast. Once again, check out icehouseventures.co.nz/startup investing or visit the link in the show notes to learn more. Now back to the show. So really, the environmental piece, that's one of the key points of objection. Other ones, like it doesn't actually do anything. There's no use case for it. It's only used by criminals. You can copy it and create your own Bitcoins, all these sorts of things that we've heard. But these narratives do need to be dismantled thoughtfully, carefully, and with respect to the person who holds them, because if you tackle it the wrong way, you're just coming across as just an annoying Bitcoiner, right? And that, unfortunately, that
Yeah,
is
exactly.
the thing. So how do
Yeah.
you kind of frame this? And if you were talking to people that do kind of get Bitcoin already, and they're out there, preaching the word to their unsaved financial friends, how do you actually get the Bitcoiners who do get it to frame it in a way which is respectful to the hearer of that message?
It's so important. And I think generally that when it comes to novel technologies, we tend to think that adoption is all because of the inherent merits of the technology and nothing to do with our ability to communicate those merits. And that's just not so. Having been a technology entrepreneur and then invested in a lot of high tech and deep tech companies, I can tell you categorically that it's two things. It's number one, the inherent merits of the technology and its market disruptive potential. But number two, it's the ability of a group of people to communicate that value to other people. And we saw that with Steve Jobs. Now, Steve Jobs was complimented for being this incredible innovator that brought these amazing disruptive technologies to the world that we use on a daily basis.
Yeah.
What he did equally well, what he was incredibly good at, but not given as much credit for, which was equally important, was he was able to communicate the value of those technologies. And we saw with the iPhone 4, when some people intercepted that technology and did their own appraisal of it, how suddenly it didn't look nearly as interesting as when Steve Jobs captivated his audience and shared why this was going to be a disruptive technology of the future. So the same is true. It's how we communicate the value of an asset or a technology is as important as the asset or the technology itself. When it comes to communicating with people who may not understand Bitcoin, or worse, may have some negative understandings of it, as I did, then it's really important to meet them where they are and to acknowledge them and not make them wrong for holding those point of views. Now, even if you may know objectively that what they're saying is factually incorrect, if that's the first thing you say, you're not going to get very far. So the first thing that's important is to acknowledge the person's right to hold their perspective, to acknowledge that you can understand and empathize with why they would think that, given the information sources they've probably had at their disposal, which are not as good as you or I might have. So what I might say when someone says, oh, why are you into Bitcoin? It's terrible for the environment. I might say something like, well, I completely understand why you'd say that, and just pause and shut up. And then the person kind of relaxes, but, oh, good. Now, a lot of the time, people aren't expecting you to agree with their opinion. They just want to be heard. They want to know that you've understood them and you've understood their perspective and you haven't made them wrong for having one. I remember when I was talking to one of the wholesale investors into our second fund, and I was catching up for a coffee, and he asked me what I was up to. And I said, well, funny you should ask. I've actually been investing my time in learning about Bitcoin mining as a possible form of climate tech. And his whole body language changed. To be very friendly up until that point, and he crossed his arms and he, furrowed his brow, and he said something to the effect of, I thought you were a climate tech investor, without irony.
Yeah.
And to which I said, well, it sounds like you've got some strong views about Bitcoin. Why don't you share them with me? And he shared them. And I said, well, let me make sure I've got this right. So what you're saying is you believe this and this and this. And he said, yeah, that's right. So it was important I let him know that I'd heard his perspective. I said, well, look, I completely get why you'd think that, because to be honest, that was what I thought to start with as well. He said, oh, okay. His body language changed. And I said, well, look, this has been something I've been looking at for the last couple of months. I'll be happy to share a little of what I've learned if you're curious. And he said, yeah, go ahead. Now, what happened in that first minute or so of the conversation was as important, if not more, than anything that I said subsequently. Because what that was doing was it was bringing me around the same side of the table as him and showing him that he wasn't wrong. I could understand his perspective. And now, rather than me trying to bludgeon some points in a debate, now I've established the frame as we're not debating each other, we're having a conversation. I'm not going to try and change your mind. I'm going to share some of what I've learned, if you're interested, which is why I said I didn't assume he was. And I said, look, if you're interested, I'm happy to share a little of what I've learned. And he said, yeah, please do. So he gave me the invitation, and now he's curious. Now he's listening, not to rebut, but to understand. And I just handled each of the points in turn. I said, well, I can completely understand why you might say that despite its promise, there's been no actual cases of it stabilizing the grid. Actually, there have been some. And I named 2 or 3, and he was like, oh, I didn't know that. And we went through point by point. Long story short, after about 10 minutes, he turned around, and again, without irony, he said, well, have you thought about your third fund being a Bitcoin mining fund?
Yeah.
So this is a guy who has care for the environment as a core value, who had a strong belief that Bitcoin was against his core value, was affronted by the fact that I could be a climate tech investor and yet be researching, even just researching Bitcoin mining. And yet within 15 minutes, he'd completely changed his view on Bitcoin. And that's only possible through that process of meeting people where they're at, having respect for their point of view, not making them wrong, letting them know you're not here to debate them, and not assuming that they're interested in what you have to say, but framing it as a conversation, not a debate.
Obviously, you thought about this, you've practiced it, and you're not precious about any narrative. You're just trying to discover the truth, right? So you're not setting up a situation where there's going to be debate. You're opening the door for learning and inviting them to come in. And if they don't want to, that's totally fine. And I think that there's something in that where Bitcoin does have the ability, because it is effectively mathematics, it is truth. It unites people on spectrums, right? Like those that are nerds, those that are hippies, they find commonality, they find common ground within this digital asset, and they both become passionate about it. And I think that is really interesting because it's a unifying investment class. It's also a technology that can do good for the environment. What do you think, though, that despite the fact that we all view the world a little bit differently, why do you think that some people get it and some people don't?
It's really interesting. There was a survey done by Troy Cross and a group of people recently across more than 3,000 Bitcoin unit users. And one of the questions they asked was whereabouts in the political spectrum they place themselves. And they expected to find this bias towards libertarian and conservative. But actually, what they found was it was very evenly distributed across the political spectrum, number one. The only anomaly they found is that if you were at either extreme, if you were very conservative or very liberal, you were more likely to be interested in Bitcoin. So that was interesting.
Mm.
And the other thing they found is there was a slight bias towards the extreme liberal as opposed to the extreme conservative. Not huge, but enough to be statistically significant. So again, that's very different to what we're traditionally told.
Mm.
And the reality is that Bitcoin is a technology for everyone. If you're libertarian, then it's a great tool for not being subject to government scrutiny, to avoiding censorship, to having a technology where you cannot be deplatformed for saying the wrong things, for doing the wrong things, and potentially minimizing the role of government. If you have more liberal values, then it's a fantastic technology for helping fight climate change, for helping the dispossessed in the global south to have a store of value where they don't get their wealth hyperinflated, where they can get remittance payments to their family without 20% of it being clipped by some Western Union middleman in the middle, or for countries, for example, in Central Africa, 17 of them, I think, who are currently on the Central African franc, which is printed in France in a form of monetary colonialism that actually gives them a hope of having a currency where they cannot just have their currency devalued at the whim of the French central bank on a given day, which is actually what has happened. Why? So that France can have more favorable exchange rates so that they can extract materials, including uranium, from all these former French colonies. So the more you research it, the more you find it, and you tend to research the things which you're interested in according to your values. So someone who has cares about social justice more will care about the social justice elements of Bitcoin. Someone who's looking at it as an investment class will find out about the investment utility. Someone who cares about separation of money from state will find out about that. Someone who cares about having a safeguard against inflation will find out about those properties as well. But it's like the internet. There's no one way that it can be used. There are multiple. And this is extremely attractive about Bitcoin.
Yeah, I love it. That's awesome. And even when you think about the individual themselves who might be attracted to it for whatever their thing is, there's probably some sort of evolution that they go through, like being a financial advisor. I'm often talking to people in the context of how can it actually help your overall portfolio of investments rise in value without it creating a significant degree of volatility. So that's kind of like
Exactly.
the utility, right? But as time goes on, those that really get it, like really get Bitcoin, there's another layer. They come for number go up, but they stay for all the other benefits. And when I zoom out and I think about this, I wonder if in other key areas, like perhaps even with the environmental piece, people might initially be attracted for the fact that, hey, this could be a tool to accelerate the adoption of renewable energy production and therefore, reduce greenhouse gases, etc. But when they stay on and they keep learning, they might find other things that resonate with other things like social
Exactly.
justice, for example.
That's
Is that
exactly what happened with me. Yeah. And so everyone has a
really?
different entry point. So for me to start with, I'm a little bit of an anomaly because I got interested. I had no interest in Bitcoin as Bitcoin. I got interested in Bitcoin mining first because it answered a problem, which is how do we reduce greenhouse emissions? And I found out that Bitcoin could be part of the solution to doing that through research. Counterintuitive, but true. And it was only after discovering that I was like, well, what is this Bitcoin thing then? What does it do? And you just inevitably get interested in exploring it a little deeper. And then I was like, oh, wow, this actually has a whole lot of utility that I never knew about,
Yeah.
which also is very value aligned, which was just mind blowing to me. And it can happen the other way around. I was on a podcast recently with a person who's an advisor to pension funds, and we approached it from completely different angles. So I was approaching it as a form of climate tech. He approached it as an investment class, but we arrived at the same point, which was the intersection of ESG and investment. He inevitably had to come to ESG because most of the pension funds he was talking to, 2/3 of them, believed that it didn't tick their ESG box. So he had to learn about its environmental utility. He had to learn about Bitcoin mining.
Mm.
Me, I started to learn about that, and people initially, I was happy just knowing about Bitcoin mining, but then it was like, well, I need to understand this asset class. I need to understand what its utility is. The people who are saying that it's wasteful, well, that can only be true if the technology has no utility. I don't know about its utility, so let me find out. And then I found out that it's got incredible utility. In fact, I've looked at about 19 different ways that it can be used, which is incredibly beneficial to humanity. So it's not true to say that it's wasteful. It's not true to say that it only has value as an asset class or as a store of value. There are a tremendous amount of uses. But again, you're not going to find them out by reading the newspaper. You're not going to find them out just through casual conversation at barbecues because it's like the internet back in the mid 90s. It's not a topic which people
Mm.
yet are talking about much over the dinner table, although that's starting to change. But we're still
Yeah.
so early. And so we're still in this
Mm.
phase where you have to do a little bit of your own research to find it out.
Yeah.
And you're a financial advisor, so you will understand better than most that it bifurcates financial advisors, right?
Hmm.
And some will embrace it and they'll say, wow, this is another asset class that I can advise my clients to adopt responsibly, given the right parameters and based on the risk return profile that they have, and you embrace it. But other ones who have done all their training in Keynesian economics and are familiar with a certain suite of asset classes, that's threatening because suddenly this is something that someone like me knows more about Bitcoin than they do as a financial advisor. Maybe they found out about it 10 years ago. They dismissed it, as I did initially.
Hmm.
And now you've got an incentive. It's easier to kind of adopt the thesis I'm smart than I'm stupid. And Bitcoin's a bit of an ego test because a lot of people, myself included, initially dismissed it and then had to come back to realize I was wrong. I was a fool. I dismissed it without understanding it. I dismissed it based on prejudice and based on first appearance, not deep understanding. I need to come back to it and reevaluate. That's a bit of a blow to the ego.
Yeah.
And we've got to be constantly vigilant against the ego because it can betray us and force us to double down on our initial incorrect takes. And you see this a lot where people, Michael Saylor was one, who back in 2013 said that it was going to go the same way as online gambling.
Yeah.
Then in 2020 said, well, I was wrong and I could have made a lot more money off Bitcoin if I hadn't dismissed it, but it's not too late. So I'm going to jump on the bus now.
Mm.
And so it's less to do with what your political orientation is. It's nothing to do with how smart you are. It has a lot to do with your intellectual curiosity and your humility. And when that's larger than your ego, then that will enable you to look at Bitcoin a second time.
Sure, I get it. And there's so much to unpack in that. And I guess like going back to kind of what we started with as well, we talked a little bit about mainstream media. And again, irrespective of where you sit on the political spectrum, would it be true to say that one of the first steps that one would need to take in order to deal with the ego, perhaps, would be to allow a little bit of intellectual rewiring to occur, which, in order for that to occur, means that you have to have a certain revelation about mainstream media. And I guess what I'm fishing for here is, do you feel like there's so much resistance to be labeled a conspiracy theorist that if you say that you don't distrust the mainstream media, you're going out on a limb too far, and
I
therefore
think there's a
people
middle
don't do it?
path. Yeah, we don't need to ask people to be generally mistrustful of the media. That's too much to ask for most people. Most of the population are somewhat skeptical of some things in the media, but they're not universally skeptical of all things, and you don't have to be. So that's the first thing. You can believe most of what you read in the media. You can think that occasionally they might get it wrong, but generally they get it right. And nothing that we've discussed challenges that worldview. The one piece that it's worth adding in is when you look at the mainstream media reporting, and this is not recent, this is back 160 years, right from the Telegraph, right through in an unbroken stream of 21 technologies. Without exception, the media reporting on every new technology, whether it's the film, the camera, even the mirror, the teddy bear, right? Devices and technologies, the computer, the internet, radio, television, everything has been negative to start with and continued for about 15 years. We had articles on the radio blaming it with reputable medical experts explaining the exact reasons why radio could cause windows to shatter, birds to die, people to become homicidal, why it causes jailbreaks. We had reputable medical experts telling us that by riding the bicycle back in the day, you could get conditions such as bicycle heart, bicycle face. And there was a completely invented terms. And that lasted not for a short time. That stayed around for 40 years, almost, about 37 years, it seems to be the track record. So we don't have to be universally skeptical of media, but we should absolutely be skeptical of a very localized form of media reporting, and that's the media reporting on nascent technologies for the first 20 years. We should be very skeptical and not use that as our source of truth.
So in cases where there's a novel new technology, then highly likely, because there are disrupted industries.
Highly likely they've got it wrong. Yeah.
Right.
Highly likely.
And that speaks to, I guess, just how the incentive structures work within the media industry, and that it still, to this day, derives revenue from industry. And often the industries that are disrupted by that new technology are the ones that are paying for advertising effectively. Is that too much of a cynical take, or is that more or less nailing it?
Not at all. It's not cynical, because if you research what happened with other disrupted industries, then it's been well documented that that's exactly what happened. So whilst we cannot say categorically that that's happening with Bitcoin, it wouldn't be a stretch of the imagination that it is. But even if it's not, there's something else at play, which is simply, it's what psychologists call the negativity bias. And that is, all human beings have this inherent bias that when something is unclear, when it's new, when it's novel, we tend to gravitate towards a negative. And it's a good thing that we do, because if we didn't do that, then as a species, we wouldn't be around. It was essential that whenever we saw something that was new on the horizon, looked like a large animal, we have to assume in the negative that that's going to eat us, not that we're going to eat it. Because the consequence of assuming in the positive and being wrong is you die. The consequence of assuming in the negative and being wrong is you go hungry for that day. So the negativity bias has worked very well at keeping us alive as a species, and sometimes it works in ways which are not in our best interests. And one of those times is when it's the uncertainty of a new technology, whether it's the internet, whether it's computer, whether it's Bitcoin. We tend to have that same negativity bias, and that can stop us getting early access to the benefits of that technology or of that asset class.
Okay. And I guess, like, on the flip side, sorry, I'm just fascinated by this idea. If the media came out in favor of something that was new and novel, I guess that's where it is appropriate to be suspicious. But in situations where it's new and novel and they come out against it, hey, maybe that's a clue that we should dig deeper and discover
Dig
what it
deeper,
really is.
correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah,
So how
particularly if
long
it's
then?
something that can have a real benefit to our life by being involved in early. Uh,
Like
I
this?
mean, a lot of good investment decisions comes down to your ability to get good quality asymmetrical information. So if your information source is the mainstream media, that's probably not a great place to get alpha anyway, and it's certainly not a great place to get alpha on the technological utility of a new technology or asset.
Yeah, totally. And I think that's why it's so important for people, even listening or watching this podcast, just to surround themselves with a variety of different independent voices out there, because you do get access to more accurate information, which you can then use to inform your investment decisions. And so I think that's great. But how long do you think it'll take before the FUD, the fear, uncertainty, and doubt that has been propagated by mainstream media in certain areas around Bitcoin, how long do you think it'll take before the effects of it finally wear off, where we're not worried about bicycle face anymore in the context of Bitcoin?
Well, if this follows the same trends as it has for other technologies, then we've got about another 2 years for the first wave, which is the most pronounced wave. And then there'll be a little lull, and then there'll be a slight aftershock. It's a little bit like a pandemic going through a population. You get these after waves, but they're not as big as the initial wave.
Sure.
And so the overall trajectory, it'll play out for about another 2 decades. We'll continue to get some level of misinformation. So we've got a while, but it won't be anywhere near as pronounced as what we've had for the last 5. And we've probably got about another 2, I would say, before we reach the end of the first wave.
Sure.
So it's on the decline. It's definitely going down. And the reason it's going down is that former critics have started to understand it. There's been a lot of peer reviewed studies that have contradicted the early narratives. And in fact, 13 of the last peer reviewed articles on Bitcoin and energy, very few people know this, have supported there being strong environmental externalities, positive externalities from Bitcoin. And so that is definitely changing the narrative. And not only that, but we've had TEPCO, the largest utility in Japan, Deutsche Telekom, the largest telecommunications company in Germany, both coming out and doing Bitcoin mining on their otherwise wasted renewable energy generation assets. So you can only claim that these benefits are theoretical when either no one's doing it or you suppress the information that no one's doing, that people are doing it. But this information is coming out and it's been reported more and more in the mainstream news. Bloomberg, there was a sustainability magazine, Recharge, that published it recently. MSN this morning published the story of how Marathon had just bought this large wind farm and was using it to mine Bitcoin and at the same time provide grid stabilization services. And this wind farm otherwise would have been useless because it was in this huge interconnection queue, but it's helping to make it more profitable. And these stories are starting to come out more and more. And so it's getting harder and harder to maintain that initial narrative.
Mm. And you've been probably one of the best voices out there, I think, in terms of, and I think objectively a lot of other people would think that as well, by the way, but I think that you've managed to communicate these data points in a way that appeals to a lot of people across quite a broad spectrum of political ideas and belief sets. And going back to what we said probably at the start, what you said at the start, where it's not enough for something to be good or amazing and novel and technologically superior. You actually have to communicate it really well. And you've tied that up really, really nicely in the last couple of years, especially just helping combat this FUD. But I guess as it is on the decline, that's encouraging because it just means that it opens up the door for the next cohort of people that will hopefully see the light and start adopting it for reasons beyond just number go up. But as it relates to that everyday normal sort of person who's not necessarily into the technology or the finance or the environment, or they're just kind of generally interested and amused by most things in life, but they've got a family, they got a job, and they're working hard, just trying to make ends meet. Why should they be caring about Bitcoin? And what would you say to them to kind of motivate them to get excited about this thing, Bitcoin?
One of the best lines I've heard is that Bitcoin is not a get rich quick scheme. It is an avoid going poor slowly scheme. And what that means is that every year, and particularly since the pandemic, we have a lot of economists telling us, hey, inflation's under control now. Everyone should be happy. But people aren't happy. They're frustrated. And why are they frustrated? Well, for a very simple reason. Sure, inflation may be 2%, 3% in most Western countries now, but for 3 years in a row, it was 6%, 7%, 8%. So a lot of people in the street have just gone through this phase where prices have inflated 20% over 3 years. Their wages haven't gone up that much. And so their dollars aren't going as far as they used to. And what have they got? Well, they can put the money in the bank. Okay, well, great. You're going to get less interest. You'll be underwater immediately. Okay, what else can you do? You can put it in the share market, or you can put it in real estate, which is what a lot of Kiwis like to do. Well, that's okay if that's going up. It's not particularly liquid. And you might go through several phases where it's not so much, it might look on the surface as though you're getting gains on your real estate. But if you analyze the purchasing power of your dollar over many years, it's actually just that the real estate is going up just enough so that you can maintain the value of what you're spending. And so you're not really getting ahead so much, or if you are, it's just above water. And there are very few assets out there that will allow you to beat the inbuilt inflationary wheel and the erosion of wealth through central government money printing, which is completely beyond your control. And so if you simply just want to have an asset just to preserve some of the wealth for your family and not have it whittled away, then it might pay just to have a little bit, just in case it catches on, as Satoshi Nakamoto said right back in the day. And what I say to people is, like, I never make a suggestion that people get Bitcoin. I suggest that people look into it, that they research it, that they understand it. And if they do decide to get some exposure, whatever level they're comfortable with, then not to be concerned about watching the day charts or the month charts, because you could invest in it and then it has these crazy big dips and it has these massive peaks, and you don't want to go on that emotional roller coaster. So the best way I think about it for just the average person is you have this asset which frees you from the tyranny of currencies being devalued by central bank money printing, which is totally beyond your control, and it gives you back control. For the first time ever. And you have the liquidity that you don't have with other asset classes. And you just treat it as if it's not even there. You put it aside for the future. You hold it for a minimum of 4 years, preferably at least 10, just secure in the knowledge that it's actually a hedge against irresponsible government policies and irresponsible central bank money printing, which is, if we look back at history, it's a pretty sure bet that they have behaved irresponsibly and they will continue to behave irresponsibly. And so if we know that that's the case and we see how monetary supply is just increasing, it's just a great way to have some control over your purchasing power of you and your family in the future.
That's great. And last question here. So you've come from not really fully understanding Bitcoin, from dismissing it to accepting it to adopting it wholeheartedly. And I guess what I'm trying to fish for here is, are you now living kind of like in a Bitcoin standard mentally right now? Like, are you, your business, the way you approach life, how has it kind of changed the way you do life? And does it feel like there's deeper realms to go into as you do this? Because like, if your source of income effectively is indirectly coming from Bitcoin, and that's where you see the future opportunities, that can change every aspect of how you live and exist, right? So how has it changed you, and where will it change you in the future, do you think?
Well, I'm a pragmatist, so I will go for whatever's easier. So I'm not some people have gone completely onto the Bitcoin standard, even though for me it makes no sense, because there are some things that fiat currency does better at the moment because Bitcoin is still quite new. And so I will use fiat when it works better, the traditional currency, and I'll use Bitcoin when it's better as well. What I'm finding, though, is that Bitcoin is working better in an increasing number of circumstances. So, for example, I write a newsletter. I have a co-author of the newsletter who's based in Kenya. And we had to work out some way where I could pay him for his work. And my goodness, trying to get money to someone in Kenya, it's a nightmare. And he would have lost a lot of it through the transaction. It would have taken days. He would have had to left the place he's living, travel into the bank. It would have been a nightmare for not a substantial amount of money. And we worked out, not because we were evangelists of Bitcoin, but because we wanted to find the best solution, that the best solution was using Bitcoin. And so I was able to transact that using the Lightning Network. It's on my phone. It goes through in seconds. The fees is less than 1 cent every single time. It's instantaneous. He doesn't have to visit a bank. And it's enabled us to, that would have been such a friction point, it would have been in doubt whether we could have continued the business relationship. So it opens up these collaborations with people in the world where previously, because they don't have good banking rails, you'd be excluded from collaborating with them. So that's been incredible. And then when I travel around the world, often I travel to places where there's good Bitcoin adoption, such as Lugano in Switzerland, such as Madeira in Portugal, and such as Uvita in Costa Rica. And whenever I go there, I generally prefer to spend Bitcoin rather than cash because, again, it's easy, it's peer-to-peer, and it's just incredibly simple. And you don't have the same fees that you do when you're transacting on Visa. So it's actually cheaper as well. So more and more I find I'm using it just because it just works so seamlessly. And I always find it funny when people say things like, oh, every transaction of Bitcoin uses this much energy. And I say, well, no, it doesn't. Because number one, Bitcoin energy doesn't come from its transactions. Number two, I've done 600 transactions plus in the last year. They were all over the Lightning Network. And then people will say, oh, well, it can't scale. It's too slow. And I said, well, again, that's nonsense because you're comparing the base layer of Bitcoin, which is its blockchain, to a layer 2 technology such as Visa, which is an apples versus orange comparison. But if you compare the layer 2 network, which is the Lightning Network, to Visa, it's much faster than Visa, much more scalable, the throughput's higher, the fees are less, and it just works. And I've got the receipts to prove it. So the more that I look into it, the more that I find that it's incredibly useful. A lot of people pay me in Bitcoin now, again, because it's just a much, much simpler way, because most of my clients don't live in the same country that I do. And as soon as you're dealing with people overseas and you have different banks involved, you see the system just become very clunky, very fast. Some of the people who I met with in Costa Rica, who had been into Bitcoin since 2014, they got into Bitcoin because most of their customers were outside Costa Rica, and they had to take such a cut in their remittance payments every single time they got paid. And so they were frustrated. They were losing a lot of their profits through it. And so they went into Bitcoin because it solved the problem of getting money into the country, getting better liquidity of supply of that cash, but also not getting those heavy fees that they're imposed along the way. So I think people kind of will adopt it as it solves problems for them. And like any technology, it's a little bit clunky to start with. Then it starts solving some problems. And then as we solve more problems, people invest more time and energy and it solves more problems and it just gets better and better and better. And the technology starts to roll out and invite more and more people in.
Yeah, that's awesome. Wow. Okay. Thank you so much, Daniel, for catching up with me and agreeing to have this chat. I think that people are going to love this conversation. So yeah, thank you. And if people want to follow you, where's the best place for them to follow you? On X?
Yeah, most of the time I spend these days when I'm online is on X. So at DS Batten is the best place. And ch4capital.com is the other place where people can get in touch with me.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you again. Once again, Daniel, enjoy the rest of your day.
Well, thanks for inviting me. It's been fun.
Cool. Good man.
Thanks for joining me today on the Everyday Investor Podcast. Hope you enjoyed that, and if you did, please share me around. For the odd giveaway, invite, and sneak peek, make sure that you've subscribed to the fortnightly newsletter. The link is in the show notes, as well as special referral codes from previous guests on the show. Remember, our show partners Ungaro & Co., Gorilla Technologies, and Icehouse Ventures. Lastly, a final reminder. Please remember this isn't financial advice. If you need that, reach out to me or your current financial advisor. Thanks again for joining me on this one, and we'll catch you next week.
Listen up, buttercup, it's disruption. Bitcoin in the game causing mass corruption. Which giant's got the most to lose? Satoshi's on the rise, who's got the blues? Big pharma, military, not opaque, guess who? One's got the clout, the other's got the crew. But here comes Bitcoin like a wrecking ball, shaking up the system, watching hubris fall. Fear, uncertainty, doubt, they spread it like a plague. Bitcoin's bad, they say, but we ride through this phase. Jimmy Stewart, my, with his hands in the pot, fighting back with lies, cause they know they'll rot. Paper shredder, y'all. Laminator, y'all. Legal and compliance, they all in the mix. Extensions, collusion, they got the trickety tricks. Woo! But Nakamoto, Arigato, disrupt the old way. Transparent, secure, it's here to stay. They say it's bad for Earth, a scam and no worth. But you're hearing stories from the ones with the purse. It's a wonderful life until they lose control. Innovation's coming, no more rockin' it roll. Who can resist, who can make it work? The industry with power, yet they're feeling the hurt. They've got the resources, the position, the might. But can they adapt or will they lose the fight? Fear, uncertainty, doubt, they spread it like a plague. Bitcoin's bad, they say, but we ride through this phase. Jimmy Stewart, my, with his hands in the pot, fighting back with lies, cause they know they'll rot. Air fryer, y'all. Hair straightener, y'all. So keep guessing, who's the one with the most to lose when Bitcoin's done? Influence for sale to the highest bidder. Influence for sale to the highest bidder. Influence for sale to the highest bidder.